The morning the war with the HOA began, the lake looked like something out of a painting my grandmother once had hanging in her hallway, the kind with brushstrokes so soft you could almost smell the damp air. A pale orange light stretched across the glassy surface, broken only by the occasional ripple where a base stirred beneath. The mist rolled low, clinging to the shoreline like it was reluctant to let the night go. I sat in my old aluminum boat, coffee steaming in the cup holder, the quiet hum of my small trolling motor the only sound competing with the distant trill of a loon. For 35 years, I had fished this water. My father's voice still echoed, in my memory from the time I was 8. "Keep your elbow loose when you cast, son. Let the rod do the work." Every trip out here was more than a hobby. It was a link to every version of me I had ever been, from the wide-eyed boy with tangled line to the man trying to teach his own son the patience of waiting for a bite. That's when I heard it, a faint droning hum over my shoulder getting louder. I turned and saw a small pontoon-style boat painted in HOA beige, the kind of color that has no name but still looks smug. At the helm sat a man in a white polo with the HOA crest stitched on the chest, sunglasses reflecting the morning sun, so I couldn't see his eyes. Behind him, a laminated sign reading Property Patrol swayed slightly in the breeze. My first thought was that maybe he was lost, because no one in all my years had ever come out to the middle of the lake to bother someone just fishing. My second thought was, uh-oh. He pulled alongside me with the kind of cautious precision that suggested he'd practiced docking next to people before. "Morning," he called, his tone carrying no warmth. "Can I ask what you're doing out here?" I glanced down at my rod, then back up at him. "Well, I was under the impression I was fishing," I said, letting the sarcasm sit there just long enough for him to decide if he wanted to acknowledge it. He didn't. "This lake is private property," he said, pulling a clipboard from under his seat. "You're in violation of HOA bylaws, Section 13, Paragraph B. No unauthorized recreational activity on association-managed waterways." I blinked at him, genuinely confused for a moment. "Association-managed? You mean you guys own the lake now?" He smirked, a tiny twitch at the corner of his mouth. "We've had stewardship for the past 3 years. Stewardship. That word landed in my stomach like a lead sinker. This lake had been here long before their McMansion neighborhood wrapped itself around one side of it, long before there was even a thought of community rules or approved recreation hours. "I've been fishing here since I was a kid," I told him. "Never needed permission before." He scribbled something on his clipboard. "And now you do. I'll need your name and address for the fine." I thought he was joking until he handed me a carbon copy slip for $1,000. Unauthorized fishing activity, payable to the Lakeside Preserve HOA. I laughed at first, the kind of laugh that comes from disbelief rather than humor. But he was already turning his boat around, calling over his shoulder, "You can appeal at the monthly board meeting if you wish, but rules are rules." The phrase hit me harder than the fine itself. Back at the dock, the air felt heavier. My neighbor Jim, who'd been mowing his lawn, saw me coming in and shook his head. "They got you too, huh?" he said. Apparently, I wasn't the first. Over the past year, the HOA had been gradually tightening their grip. New permits for kayak use, no swimming after 8 p.m., even banning kids from skipping stones on the shore. Said it was for wildlife protection, Jim grumbled. Funny how the wildlife they're protecting is themselves. By the time I got home, the fine slip sat in my pocket like a burning coal. My wife, Karen, was in the kitchen making breakfast, and I dropped it on the table without saying a word. She read it slowly, then looked at me over her glasses. "You're not paying this." I shook my head. Not a chance. But the truth was, I didn't yet know what I was going to do. All I knew was this: nobody takes away my lake. Not them, not anyone. 2 days later, I walked into the HOA office. A converted ranch house with fake stone columns and a flagpole out front, the stars and stripes sharing space with the HOA's own flag like they were equally important. The smell of coffee and air freshener hit me as I stepped inside. A young receptionist looked up. "Can I help you?" she asked in that polite but practiced tone of someone paid to be the first line of defense. I told her I was there to appeal a fine. She motioned to a small seating area where a framed mission statement on the wall declared their purpose to foster harmony and maintain property values. Harmony. Right. When they finally called me into the boardroom, I found 5 people sitting around a long table, each with a binder in front of them. The president, a tall man with a silver watch and the kind of tan that screamed country club, greeted me with a smile that never reached his eyes. I explained my history with the lake, how my father taught me to fish there, how I'd been doing it for decades. He listened, nodding occasionally, and when I finished, he said, "I understand your sentiment, but the bylaws are clear. Our community has invested in maintaining the lake, and we have to ensure it's used responsibly." I wanted to tell him about the years before they showed up, how the lake took care of itself just fine without their oversight, but I could already see where this was going. "The fine stands," he said, closing his binder. "Rules are rules." That phrase again, like a nail sealing the coffin. I walked out without another word, but inside, something had shifted. By the time I reached my truck, the plan wasn't fully formed, but the resolve was. They thought they owned the lake. They thought they could dictate who was welcome and who wasn't. They thought wrong. I couldn't stop thinking about that word. Stewardship. It rolled around in my head like a lure spinning uselessly in the current. Ownership was one thing, management was another, and stewardship. Well, that sounded like a fancy way of saying we're pretending it's ours until someone tells us otherwise. The morning after my HOA appeal went exactly nowhere, I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat down at the old oak desk in my study, and pulled out my laptop. If there's one thing I learned from years of running my own small contracting business, it's that paper trails tell the real story. People can bluff all they want, but deeds, records, and filings, they don't lie. The county's online. Property database was slow, clunky, and looked like it hadn't been updated since the Bush administration, but it worked. I typed in Lakeside Preserve HOA and scrolled through their listed properties. They owned the clubhouse, the community park, the boat launch, all the obvious stuff. But when I searched for the lake itself, my heart gave a little jump. No result. I tried another search, just for the parcel number printed on the county's GIS map, where the lake sat like a deep blue jewel. The owner wasn't the HOA. It was something called Clearwater Holdings, LLC, registered to a P.O. box in another county. My fingers drummed on the desk. Clearwater Holdings, never heard of them. I dug deeper. Clearwater was formed in the early 90s, back when the lake was part of an old family estate that included hunting land, a few cabins, and the shoreline. The company's annual reports were bare bones, just enough to keep them active. The registered agent was a small law firm that specialized in legacy property management, which told me one thing: this was a paper shell, likely holding the property for a group of heirs who couldn't agree on what to do with it. That explained a lot. If the HOA didn't own the lake, they couldn't legally stop people from fishing unless they had some agreement with Clearwater. I checked for easements, usage contracts, anything that might give them rights to enforce bylaws on the water. Nothing. Not a single binding document. It was like they just started acting as if they owned it, counting on no one to question them. I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window at the wind pushing small ripples across the surface of my coffee. My father always said, "Son, there's more than one way to catch a fish. Sometimes you use a hook, sometimes you use your head." That afternoon, I drove into town to visit the county clerk's office. The place smelled faintly of paper and dust, and the floors squeaked under my boots. The clerk on duty was a woman named Marlene who'd been there since before I was born. She knew every land parcel in the county like she knew her own kitchen. When I told her I was curious about the history of the lake's ownership, she didn't ask why, just led me back to a row of filing cabinets older than both of us. Started out as part of the Johnson estate, she said, flipping through brittle manila folders. Old man Johnson died without a will. Took years to sort out. Eventually, the land was split. Some sold, some put into holding. That's your Clearwater holdings right there. They've been sitting on it for decades. She slid the file across the counter. Inside were photocopies of deeds, survey maps with hand-drawn lines, and letters from lawyers long retired. Something caught my eye. A faded black-and-white photograph of the lake from the 1940s, with handwritten notes on the back. It was from a county surveyor, noting public access via County Road to East Bank. That road, I realized, still existed, or at least the overgrown remains of it did, meaning there might still be a legal public access point the HOA didn't know about or wanted to pretend didn't exist. I spent the next few days driving around the lake, taking photos, marking property lines. I even stopped by the bait shop on the edge of town, where old-timers like Earl, who had fished this water longer than I'd been alive, swapped stories. Earl spat into a coffee cup and told me, "Them HOA folks don't own a drop of that water. They just yell loud enough so people believe 'em. But that lake's been ours for generations." The more I heard, the angrier I got. It wasn't just about me anymore. This was about everyone who'd been run off, fined, or humiliated by a group of self-appointed gatekeepers. One evening, I was at my desk again, sifting through Clearwater's corporate filings, when I found something that nearly made me spit my drink. A notice of intent to dissolve. Clearwater Holdings LLC was planning to sell off all remaining assets within the year. The lake was about to be on the market. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, my heart thumping. The idea that had been lurking in the back of my mind since the day on the water came roaring to the front. I could buy it. I could own the very thing they thought they controlled. And if I did, I smiled to myself, already imagining the look on the HOA president's face. The night I discovered Clearwater Holdings was preparing to dissolve, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan, watching the blades cut through the shadows, my mind racing with possibilities. The HOA thought they had me cornered, with their fines and bylaws, but suddenly the boardroom smiles and smug rules rang hollow in my ears. They didn't own the lake, not legally, not even technically. They were imposters standing on ground that wasn't theirs, and if I moved fast enough, I could make sure it never would be. By morning, I was sitting across from a lawyer named Daniels in his office downtown. Daniels was a sharp man in his 50s with a reputation for handling messy land matters. He leaned back in his leather chair, flipping through the file I'd printed out from Clearwater's filings. "You understand what this means?" he asked, tapping his pen against the paper. "If they dissolve, the assets are liquidated. The lake, the surrounding parcels, everything. Could be auctioned, could be private sale. Either way, it's up for grabs." "I want it," I said plainly. Daniels raised an eyebrow. "Do you know what you're saying? We're not talking about a half-acre lot here. We're talking about a lake. That's no small purchase." I told him I'd saved over the years, built up investments, and had the means if the numbers worked. But more than that, I told him, this wasn't about dollars. This was about legacy. My father taught me to fish there. My son deserved to do the same without some HOA stooge breathing down his neck. Daniel studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, let's see what strings we can pull." The next few weeks blurred into a mess of phone calls, document requests, and quiet negotiations. Clearwater Holdings wasn't just one entity. It was a tangle of heirs, cousins, and distant relatives who still had claims on pieces of the estate. Some didn't care. One signed off with nothing more than, "Good riddance. I never liked the lake anyway." Others treated it like gold, demanding more than their share, suspicious of my motives. I drove hours out of town to meet one heir at a diner off the interstate. She was in her 70s, thin as a rail, with eyes sharp as a hawk. She sipped her tea and studied me over the rim of her cup. "You really want that lake?" she asked. "It ruined this family. Fights, lawsuits, bitterness, and now you want to drag it back to life?" "I don't want to drag it anywhere," I said. "I want to give it peace. I want it to be what it always was, a place to fish, to breathe, to belong. Not some HOA trophy." Something softened in her expression. She signed, but not everyone was that easy. Another heir tried to leverage the situation, demanding triple his stake. Daniels leaned across the table at that meeting and said coldly, "You realize if you don't sign, your portion becomes worthless in liquidation, right? You'll walk. Away with nothing." The man sputtered and cursed, but eventually relented. All the while, I kept my head low in the neighborhood. I still waved at neighbors, still mowed my lawn, still acted as if the fine was just another irritation. But inside, I was sitting on a secret that burned hotter every day. The HOA must have sensed something, because soon letters started arriving in my mailbox. First, a reminder about outstanding fines, then a warning that my fishing privileges were suspended indefinitely. Finally, a thinly veiled threat. "Interference with community property rights will result in legal consequences." I laughed when I read that one. Community property rights, I thought. You don't own what you never bought. Still, Daniels warned me to keep quiet. "They'll try to block you if they know what's happening. Let them think they've scared you off." So I kept fishing elsewhere, biding my time. While the paperwork wound its way through the channels of law, the day I signed the final deed, the sky outside Daniels's office was the clearest blue I'd seen in months. He slid the folder across the desk with a grin. "Congratulations," he said. "You are now the legal owner of Clearwater Lake." For a moment, I just stared at the words. Owner. Not tenant, not guest, not rule breaker. Owner. I felt a weight lift off me. The weight of every smug smile, every rules are rules, every carbon copy fine slip shoved into my hand. That night, I sat at my desk drafting the new regulations. I kept them simple. No HOA activity permitted without written consent. No boats, swimming, or fishing for non-authorized individuals. Trespassers will be prosecuted. And just to twist the knife, I printed every notice on heavy paper with my new letterhead at the top, Clearwater Lake, private property, owner, my name. 2 weeks later, every mailbox in the HOA community had one waiting inside. I didn't need to see their faces to know the chaos it caused. I could almost hear the shouts echoing across the manicured lawns. I imagined the HOA president holding the letter, his hands trembling, his tan fading a shade paler. They thought they had written the rules. Now they were about to learn I wrote the lake. The Saturday after I dropped those notices in every HOA mailbox, I made sure to be up before dawn. Not because I expected anything to happen that early, but because I wanted to be there, on my boat, rod in hand, coffee steaming against the morning air, when the storm broke. The lake was calm that morning, almost suspiciously so, as if it knew it was about to witness history. Mist drifted low across the water. I cast my line into the glassy surface and waited, my ears tuned to every sound coming from the direction of the boat launch. Around 8, the first minivan rolled in, stacked with coolers and inflatable tubes. A father in flip-flops unloaded, fishing rods from the trunk while his kids ran toward the dock. Then came a couple on jet skis, helmets dangling from their arms, chatting about the perfect day on the water. By 9 o'clock, the place looked like a full-blown beach party in the making, at least 20 families unloading grills, rafts, kayaks, you name it. Then they saw the signs. I had posted them everywhere, heavy-duty aluminum placards bolted to posts along the shoreline, each one reading in bold block letters, "Private property, no trespassing. Authorized access only. Owner, Clearwater. Lake Estate." Confused looks spread like ripples across the crowd. Parents squinted at the wording. Kids asked questions. Some shrugged and tried to head for the water anyway, until they met the uniformed guard I'd hired. A retired sheriff's deputy named Miller. He stood tall at the dock in his crisp uniform, mirrored sunglasses hiding his eyes, arms folded like a man who had no time for arguments. "Sorry, folks," he said evenly as the first group approached. "This property is closed to HOA residents. Lake access is restricted." The father in flip-flops barked a laugh. "Restricted? We've been coming here for years. My HOA fees pay for this." Miller didn't flinch. "No, sir. Your fees maintain the clubhouse and common areas. The lake, however, is not HOA property. It is privately owned, as of 2 weeks ago. By him." He pointed out to where I sat in my boat, line cast, sipping coffee as the sun crept higher. Dozens of eyes turned my way. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. I lifted my mug in a slow, deliberate salute. That's when the shouting began. People stormed back to their cars, clutching the notices I'd mailed. One man waved his in the air like a battle flag, yelling, "This is a joke! The board will fix this!" Others crowded around the HOA president, who had just arrived in his pristine SUV, wearing his usual golf shirt and forced smile. But the smile didn't last. As angry residents shoved the letters in his face, demanding answers, his tan seemed to drain to ash. "I pulled my boat closer to shore just to hear the chaos. This can't be legal." One woman shrieked, "He bought the whole damn lake!" Another man shouted, pointing at me, "How did you let this happen?" The president tried to calm them, promising legal recourse, insisting the HOA had rights. But when someone asked him to show the deed, he faltered. That was my cue. I motored slowly to the dock, stepped off my boat, and handed the president a manila folder. Inside was a certified copy of the deed, stamped and signed by the county. "This lake doesn't belong to your HOA," I said, my voice calm, steady. "It belongs to me, which means your rules mean nothing here." The crowd erupted, some in outrage, others in stunned silence. The president's hands shook as he flipped through the pages, his lips moving like he couldn't quite process the words. Finally, he looked up, his voice breaking. You can't just ban everyone." "Can't I?" I said. "You fined me for fishing on water you never owned. You embarrassed neighbors, threatened families, scared kids off this shoreline. You wanted the lake exclusive. Congratulations, it is exclusively mine." For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the lapping of water against the dock. Then a little boy tugged his father's sleeve and whispered, "Does this mean we can't fish anymore, Dad?" The father glared at the president, then at the board members who had trickled in behind him. The HOA's empire was crumbling right there on the dock. By the following week, the board meeting was chaos. I heard from a friend who still lived under their thumb that dozens of residents packed into the clubhouse, demanding answers, waving copies of the deed. The president tried to spin it, promising lawsuits, but when a local attorney stood up and confirmed my ownership was airtight, the room exploded into shouting. Some even called for the entire board to resign. Meanwhile, I enjoyed the quiet. The lake, once overrun with noisy jet skis and HOA patrol boats, returned to the way it had been when I was a boy. The water was calm. The fish returned to shallower banks. Birds nested along the reeds again. And one morning, when the mist lay low and the sun broke through the pines, I took my son out in the boat. He cast his line with a little too much enthusiasm, the lure plopping into the water with a splash. I smiled, correcting his grip, just as my father once corrected mine. "Easy," I told him. "Let the rod do the work." He laughed, and for the first time in months, I felt the peace I'd been fighting for. The HOA had wanted to make the lake exclusive. And in a way, I supposed. They got their wish. They just weren't invited.